Good evening. Today we'll be reading from Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackey to help you drift off to sleep. In reading the history of nations, we find that, like individuals, they have their whims and their peculiarities, their seasons of excitement and recklessness, when they care not what they do. We find that whole communities suddenly fix their minds upon one object and go mad in its pursuit, that millions of people become simultaneously impressed with one delusion and run after it till their attention is caught by some new folly more captivating than the first. We see one nation suddenly seized, from its highest to its lowest members, with a fierce desire of military glory, another as suddenly becoming crazed upon a religious scruple, and neither of them recovering its senses until it has shed rivers of blood and sowed a harvest of groans and tears to be reaped by its posterity. At an early age in the annals of Europe, its population lost their wits about the sepulchre of Jesus and crowded in frenzied multitudes to the Holy Land. Another age went mad for fear of the devil and offered up hundreds of thousands of victims to the delusion of witchcraft. At another time, the many became crazed on the subject of the philosopher's stone and committed follies till then unheard of in the pursuit. It was once thought a venial offense in very many countries of Europe to destroy an enemy by slow poison. Persons who would have revolted at the idea of stabbing a man to the heart drugged his pottage without scruple. Ladies of gentle birth and manners caught the contagion of murder until poisoning under their auspices became quite fashionable. Some delusions, though notorious to all the world, have subsisted for ages, flourishing as widely among civilized and polished nations as among the early barbarians with whom they originated. That of dueling, for instance, and the belief in omens and divination of the future, which seem to defy the progress of knowledge to eradicate them entirely from the popular mind. Money, again, has often been a cause of the delusion of multitudes. Sober nations have all at once become desperate gamblers and risked almost their existence upon the turn of a piece of paper. To trace the history of the most prominent of these delusions is the object of the present pages. Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one. Some of the subjects introduced may be familiar to the reader, but the author hopes that sufficient novelty of detail will be found even in these to render them acceptable, while they could not be wholly omitted in justice to the subject of which it was proposed to treat. The Memoirs of the South Sea Madness and the Mississippi Delusion are more complete and copious than are to be found elsewhere, and the same may be said of the history of the witch mania, which contains an account of its terrific progress in Germany, a part of the subject which has been left comparatively untouched by Sir Walter Scott in his letters on demonology and witchcraft, the most important that have yet appeared on this fearful but most interesting subject. Popular delusions began so early, spread so widely, and have lasted so long, that instead of 2 or 3 volumes, 50 would scarcely suffice to detail their history. The present may be considered more of a miscellany of delusions than a history, a chapter only in the great and awful book of human folly which yet remains to be written, and which Porson once jestingly said he would write in 500 volumes. Interspersed are sketches of some lighter matters, amusing instances of the imitativeness and wrong-headedness of the people, rather than examples of folly and delusion. Religious matters have been purposely excluded as incompatible with the limits prescribed to the present work. A mere list of them would alone be sufficient to occupy a volume. Money Mania, the Mississippi Scheme. The personal character and career of one man are so intimately connected with the great scheme of the years 1719 and 1720 that a history of the Mississippi Madness can have no fitter introduction than a sketch of the life of its great author, John Law. Historians are divided in opinion as to whether they should designate him a knave or a madman. Both epithets were unsparingly applied to him in his lifetime, and while the unhappy consequences of his projects were still deeply felt, posterity, however, has found reason to doubt the justice of the accusation, and to confess that John Law was neither knave nor madman, but one more deceived than deceiving, more sinned against than sinning. He was thoroughly acquainted with the philosophy and true principles of credit. He understood the monetary question better than any man of his day, and if his system fell with a crash so tremendous, it was not so much his fault as that of the people amongst whom he had erected it. He did not calculate upon the avaricious frenzy of a whole nation. He did not see that confidence, like mistrust, could be increased almost ad infinitum, and that hope was as extravagant as fear. How was he to foretell that the French people, like the man in the fable, would kill in their frantic eagerness the fine goose he had brought to lay them so many golden eggs? His fate was like that which may be supposed to have overtaken the first adventurous boatman who rode from Erie to Ontario. Broad and smooth was the river upon which he embarked. Rapid and pleasant was his progress. And who was to stay him in his career? Alas, for him, the cataract was nigh. He saw, when it was too late, that the tide which wafted him so joyously along was a tide of destruction, and when he endeavored to retrace his way, he found that the current was too strong for his weak efforts to stem, and that he drew nearer every instant to the tremendous falls. Down he went over the sharp rocks and the waters with him. He was dashed to pieces with his bark, but the waters, maddened and turned to foam by the rough descent, only boiled and bubbled for a time, and then flowed on again as smoothly as ever. Just so it was with Law and the French people. He was the boatman, and they were the waters. John Law was born at Edinburgh in the year 1671. His father was the younger son of an ancient family in Fife, and carried on the business of a goldsmith and banker. He amassed considerable wealth in his trade, sufficient to enable him to gratify the wish so common among his countrymen of adding a territorial designation to his name. He purchased with this view the estates of Lauriston and Randleston on the Firth of Forth, on the borders of West and Midlothian, and was thenceforth known as Law of Lauriston. The subject of our memoir, being the eldest son, was received into his father's counting house at the age of 14, and for 3 years laboured hard to acquire an insight into the principles of banking as then carried on in Scotland. He had always manifested great love for the study of numbers, and his proficiency in the mathematics was considered extraordinary in one of his tender years. At the age of 17, he was tall, strong, and well made, and his face, although deeply scarred with the smallpox, was agreeable in its expression, and full of intelligence. At this time he began to neglect his business, and, becoming vain of his person, indulged in considerable extravagance of attire. He was a great favourite with the ladies, by whom he was called Beau Law, while the other sex, despising his foppery, nicknamed him Jessamy John. At the death of his father, which happened in 1688, he withdrew entirely from the desk which had become so irksome, and being possessed of the revenues of the paternal estate of Lauriston, he proceeded to London to see the world. He was now very young, very vain, good-looking, tolerably rich, and quite uncontrolled. It is no wonder that on his arrival in the capital he should launch out into extravagance. He soon became a regular frequenter of the gaming houses, and by pursuing a certain plan based upon some abstruse calculation of chances, he contrived to gain considerable sums. All the gamblers envied him his luck, and many made it a point to watch his play and stake their money on the same chances. In affairs of gallantry he was equally fortunate. Ladies of the first rank smiled graciously upon the handsome Scotchman. The young, the rich, the witty, and the obliging. But all these successes only paved the way for reverses. After he had been for 9 years exposed to the dangerous attractions of the gay life he was leading, he became an irrecoverable gambler. As his love of play increased in violence, it diminished in prudence. Great losses were only to be repaired by still greater ventures, and one unhappy day he lost more than he could repay without mortgaging his family estate. To that step he was driven at last. At the same time, his gallantry brought him into trouble. A love affair or slight flirtation with a lady of the name of Villiers exposed him to the resentment of a Mr. Wilson, by whom he was challenged to fight a duel. Law accepted, and had the ill fortune to shoot his antagonist dead upon the spot. He was arrested the same day and brought to trial for murder by the relatives of Mr. Wilson. He was afterwards found guilty and sentenced to death. The sentence was commuted to a fine upon the ground that the offence only amounted to manslaughter. An appeal being lodged by a brother of the deceased, Law was detained in the King's Bench, whence, by some means or other, which he never explained, he contrived to escape, and an action being instituted against the sheriffs, he was advertised in the Gazette, and a reward offered for his apprehension. He was described as Captain John Law, a Scotchman, aged 26, a very tall, black, lean man, well-shaped, above 6 feet high, with large pock-holes in his face, big-nosed, and speaking broad and loud. As this was rather a caricature than a description of him, it has been supposed that it was drawn up with a view to favour his escape. He succeeded in reaching the continent, where he travelled for 3 years, and devoted much of his attention to the monetary and banking affairs of the countries through which he passed. He stayed a few months in Amsterdam, and speculated to some extent in the funds. His mornings were devoted to the study of finance and the principles of trade, and his evenings to the gaming house. It is generally believed that he returned to Edinburgh in the year 1700. It is certain that he published in that city his proposals and reasons for constituting a council of trade. This pamphlet did not excite much attention. In a short time afterwards, he published a project for establishing what he called a land bank, the notes issued by which were never to exceed the value of the entire lands of the state upon ordinary interest, or were to be equal in value to the land, with the right to enter into possession at a certain time. The project excited a good deal of discussion in the Scottish Parliament, and a motion for the establishment of such a bank was brought forward by a neutral party called the Squadrone, whom Law had interested in his favour. The Parliament ultimately passed a resolution to the effect that to establish any kind of paper credit so as to force it to pass was an improper expedient for the nation. Upon the failure of this project, and of his efforts to procure a pardon for the murder of Mr. Wilson, Law withdrew to the continent and resumed his old habits of gaming. For 14 years he continued to roam about in Flanders, Holland, Germany, Hungary, Italy, and France. He soon became intimately acquainted with the extent of the trade and resources of each, and daily more confirmed in his opinion that no country could prosper without a paper currency. During the whole of this time, he appears to have chiefly supported himself by successful play. At every gambling house of note in the capitals of Europe, he was known and appreciated as one better skilled in the intricacies of chance than any other man of the day. It is stated in the Biographie Universelle that he was expelled, first from Venice and afterwards from Genoa, by the magistrates who thought him a visitor too dangerous for the youth of those cities. During his residence in Paris, he rendered himself obnoxious to D'Argenson, the lieutenant general of the police, by whom he was ordered to quit the capital. This did not take place, however, before he had made the acquaintance in the saloons of the Duc de Vendôme, the Prince de Conti, and of the gay Duke of Orleans, the latter of whom was destined afterwards to exercise so much influence over his fate. The Duke of Orleans was pleased with the vivacity and good sense of the Scottish adventurer, while the latter was no less pleased with the wit and amiability of a prince who promised to become his patron. They were often thrown into each other's society, and Law seized every opportunity to instill his financial doctrines into the mind of one whose proximity to the throne pointed him out as destined, at no very distant date, to play an important part in the government. Shortly before the death of Louis XIV, or as some say, in 1708, Law proposed a scheme of finance to Desmarais, the comptroller. Louis is reported to have inquired whether the projector were a Catholic, and on being answered in the negative, to have declined having anything to do with him. It was after this repulse that he visited Italy. His mind being still occupied with schemes of finance, he proposed to Victor Amadeus, Duke of Savoy, to establish his land bank in that country. The Duke replied that his dominions were too circumscribed for the execution of so great a project, and that he was by far too poor a potentate to be ruined. He advised him, however, to try the King of France once more, for he was sure, if he knew anything of the French character, that the people would be delighted with a plan not only so new, but so plausible. Louis XIV died in 1715, and the heir to the throne being an infant only 7 years of age, the Duke of Orleans assumed the reins of government as regent during his minority. Law now found himself in a more favorable position. The tide in his affairs had come, which, taken at the flood, was to waft him on to fortune. The regent was his friend, already acquainted with his theory and pretensions, and inclined, moreover, to aid him in any efforts to restore the wounded credit of France, bowed down to the earth by the extravagance of the long reign of Louis XIV. Hardly was that monarch laid in his grave ere the popular hatred, suppressed so long, burst forth against his memory. He, who during his life had been flattered with an excess of adulation to which history scarcely offers a parallel, was now cursed as a tyrant, a bigot, and a plunderer. His statues were pelted and disfigured, his effigies torn down amid the execrations of the populace, and his name rendered synonymous with selfishness and oppression. The glory of his arms was forgotten, and nothing was remembered but his reverses, his extravagance, and his cruelty. The finances of the country were in a state of the utmost disorder. A profuse and corrupt monarch, whose profuseness and corruption were imitated by almost every functionary, from the highest to the lowest grade, had brought France to the verge of ruin. The national debt amounted to 3,000 millions of livres, the revenue to 145 millions, and the expenses of government to 142 millions per annum, leaving only 3 millions to pay the interest upon 3,000 millions. The first care of the regent was to discover a remedy for an evil of such magnitude, and a council was early summoned to take the matter into consideration. The Duc de Saint-Simon was of opinion that nothing could save the country from revolution, but a remedy at once bold and dangerous. He advised the regent to convoke the States General and declare a national bankruptcy. The Duc de Noailles, a man of accommodating principles, represented the expedient as alike dishonest. The Duc de Noailles, a man of accommodating principles, an accomplished courtier, and totally averse from giving himself any trouble or annoyance that ingenuity could escape from, opposed the project of Saint-Simon with all his influence. He represented the expedient as alike dishonest and ruinous. The regent was of the same opinion, and this desperate remedy fell to the ground. The measures ultimately adopted, though they promised fair, only aggravated the evil. The first and most dishonest measure was of no advantage to the state. A recoinage was ordered, by which the currency was depreciated 1/5. Those who took 1,000 pieces of gold or silver to the mint received back an amount of coin of the same nominal value, but only 4/5 the weight of metal. By this contrivance the treasury gained 72 millions of livres, and all the commercial operations of the country were disordered. A trifling diminution of the taxes silenced the clamours of the people, and for the slight present advantage the great prospective evil was forgotten. A chamber of justice was next instituted to inquire into the malversations of the loan contractors and the farmers of the revenues. Tax collectors are never very popular in any country. but those of France at this period deserved all the odium with which they were loaded. As soon as these farmers general, with all their hosts of subordinate agents, called country, called maltôtiers, were called to account for their misdeeds, the most extravagant joy took possession of the nation. The Chamber of Justice, instituted chiefly for this purpose, was endowed with very extensive powers. It was composed of the presidents and councils of the Parliament, the judges of the courts of aid and of requests, and the officers of the Chamber of Account, under the general presidence of the Minister of Finance. Informers were encouraged to give evidence against the offenders by the promise of 1/5 part of the fines and confiscations. 1/10 of all concealed effects belonging to the guilty was promised to such as should furnish the means of discovering them. The promulgation of the edict constituting this court caused a degree of consternation among those principally concerned, which can only be accounted for on the supposition that their peculation had been enormous. But they met with no sympathy. The proceedings against them justified their terror. The Bastille was soon unable to contain the prisoners that were sent to it, and the jails all over the country teemed with guilty or suspected persons. An order was issued to all innkeepers and postmasters to refuse horses to such as endeavoured to seek safety in flight, and all persons were forbidden, under heavy fines, to harbour them or favour their evasion. Some were condemned to the pillory, others to the galleys, and the least guilty to fine and imprisonment. One only, Samuel Bernard, a rich banker and farmer general of a province remote from the capital, was sentenced to death. So great had been the illegal profits of this man, looked upon as the tyrant and oppressor of his district, that he offered 6 millions of livres, or 250,000 sterling, to be allowed to escape. His bribe was refused, and he suffered the penalty of death. Others, perhaps more guilty, were more fortunate. Confiscation, owing to the concealment of their treasures by the delinquents, often produced less money than a fine. The severity of the government relaxed, and fines under the denomination of taxes were indiscriminately levied upon all offenders. But so corrupt was every department of the administration that the country benefited but little by the sums which thus flowed into the treasury. Courtiers and courtiers' wives and mistresses came in for the chief share of the spoils. One contractor had been taxed, in proportion to his wealth and guilt, at the sum of 12 millions of livres. The Count, a man of some weight in the government, called upon him, and offered to procure a remission of the fine, if he would give him 100,000 crowns. Vous êtes trop tard, mon ami, replied the financier. I have already made a bargain with your wife for 50,000. About 180 millions of livres were levied in this manner, of which 80 were applied in payment of the debts contracted by the government. The remainder found its way into the pockets of the courtiers. Madame de Maintenon, writing on this subject, says we hear every day of some new grant on the regent. The people murmur very much at this mode of employing the money taken from the peculators. The people, who after the first burst of their resentment is over, generally express a sympathy for the weak, were indignant that so much severity should be used to so little purpose. They did not see the justice of rubbing one set of rogues to fatten another. In a few months, all the more guilty had been brought to punishment, and the Chamber of Justice looked for victims in humbler walks of life. Charges of fraud and extortion were brought against tradesmen of good character in consequence of the great inducements held out to common informers. They were compelled to lay open their affairs before this tribunal in order to establish their innocence. The voice of complaint resounded from every side, and at the expiration of a year, the government found it advisable to discontinue further proceedings. The Chamber of Justice was suppressed, and a general amnesty granted to all against whom no charges had yet been preferred. In the midst of this financial confusion, law appeared upon the scene. No man felt more deeply than the regent the deplorable state of the country, but no man could be more averse from putting his shoulders manfully to the wheel. He disliked business. He signed official documents without proper examination, and trusted to others what he should have undertaken himself. The cares inseparable from his high office were burdensome to him. He saw that something was necessary to be done, but he lacked the energy to do it, and had not virtue enough to sacrifice his ease and his pleasures in the attempt. No wonder that with this character he listened favorably to the mighty projects, so easy of execution, of the clever adventurer whom he had formerly known, and whose talents he appreciated. When Law presented himself at court, he was most cordially received. He offered 2 memorials to the regent, in which he set forth the evils that had befallen France, owing to an insufficient currency, at different times depreciated. He asserted that a metallic currency, unaided by a paper money, was wholly inadequate to the wants of a commercial country, and particularly cited the examples of Great Britain and Holland to shew the advantages of paper. He used many sound arguments on the subject of credit, and proposed as a means of restoring that of France, then at so low an ebb among the nations, that he should be allowed to set up a bank, which should have the management of the royal revenues, and issue notes both on that and on landed security. He further proposed that his bank should be administered in the king's name, but subject to the control of commissioners to be named by the States General. While these memorials were under consideration, Law translated into French his essay on money and trade, and used every means to extend through the nation his renown as a financier. He soon became talked of. The confidence of the regent spread abroad his praise, and every one expected great things of Monsieur Las. On the 5th of May, 1716, a royal edict was published, by which Law was authorized in conjunction with his brother to establish a bank under the name of Law and Company, the notes of which should be received in payment of the taxes. The capital was fixed at 6 millions of livres, in 12,000 shares of 500 livres each, purchasable 1/4 in specie, and the remainder in billets d'état. It was not thought expedient to grant him the whole of the privileges prayed for in his memorials until experience should have shewn their safety and advantage. Law was now on the high road to fortune. The study of 30 years was brought to guide him in the management of his bank. He made all his notes payable at sight, and in the coin current at the time they were issued. This last was a masterstroke of policy, and immediately rendered his notes more valuable than the precious metals. The latter were constantly liable to depreciation by the unwise tampering of the government. 1,000 livres of silver might be worth their nominal value one day, and be reduced 1/6 the next, but a note of Law's bank retained its original value. He publicly declared at the same time that a banker deserved death if he made issues without having sufficient security to answer all demands. The consequence was that his notes advanced rapidly in public estimation, and were received at 1% more than specie. It was not long before the trade of the country felt the benefit. Languishing commerce began to lift up her head. The taxes were paid with greater regularity and less murmuring, and a degree of confidence was established that could not fail, if it continued to become still more advantageous. In the course of a year, Law's notes rose to 15% premium, while the billets d'état, or notes issued by the government as security for the debts contracted by the extravagant Louis XIV, were at a discount of no less than 78.5%. The comparison was too great in favor of Law not to attract the attention of the whole kingdom, and his credit extended itself day by day. Branches of his bank were almost simultaneously established at Lyons, Rochelle, Tours, Amiens, and Orleans. The regent appears to have been utterly astonished at his success, and gradually to have conceived the idea that paper, which could so aid a metallic currency, could entirely supersede it. Upon this fundamental error he afterwards acted. In the meantime, Law commenced the famous project which has handed his name down to posterity. He proposed to the regent, who could refuse him nothing, to establish a company that should have the exclusive privilege of trading to the great river Mississippi and the province of Louisiana on its western bank. The country was supposed to abound in the precious metals, and the company, supported by the profits of their exclusive commerce, were to be the sole farmers of the taxes and sole coiners of money. Letters patent were issued, incorporating the company in August 1717. The capital was divided into 200,000 shares of 500 livres each, the whole of which might be paid in billets d'état at their nominal value, although worth no more than 160 livres in the market. It was now that the frenzy of speculating began to seize upon the nation. Law's bank had effected so much good that any promises for the future which he thought proper to make were readily believed. The regent every day conferred new privileges upon the fortunate projector. The bank obtained the monopoly of the sale of tobacco, the sole right of refinage of gold and silver, and was finally erected into the Royal Bank of France. Amid the intoxication of success, both Law and the regent forgot the maxim so loudly proclaimed by the former, that a banker deserved death who made issues of paper without the necessary funds to provide for them. As soon as the bank from a private became a public institution, the regent caused a fabrication of notes to the amount of 1,000 millions of livres. This was the first departure from sound principles, and one for which Law is not justly blamable. While the affairs of the bank were under his control, the issues had never exceeded 60 millions. Whether Law opposed the inordinate increase is not known, but as it took place as soon as the bank was made a royal establishment, it is but fair to lay the blame of the change of system upon the regent. Law found that he lived under a despotic government, but he was not yet aware of the pernicious influence which such a government could exercise upon so delicate a framework as that of credit. He discovered it afterwards to his cost, but in the meantime suffered himself to be impelled by the regent into courses which his own reason must have disapproved. With a weakness most culpable, he lent his aid in inundating the country with paper money, which, based upon no solid foundation, was sure to fall sooner or later. The extraordinary present fortune dazzled his eyes, and prevented him from seeing the evil day that would burst over his head when once from any cause or other the alarm was sounded. The Parliament were from the first jealous of his influence as a foreigner, and had besides their misgivings as to the safety of his projects. As his influence extended, their animosity increased. D'Aguesseau, the Chancellor, was unceremoniously dismissed by the regent for his opposition to the vast increase of paper money, and the constant depreciation of the gold and silver coin of the realm. This only served to augment the enmity of the Parliament, and when D'Argenson, a man devoted to the interests of the regent, was appointed to the vacant chancellorship, and made at the same time Minister of Finance, they became more violent than ever. The first measure of the new minister caused a further depreciation of the coin. In order to extinguish the billets d'état, it was ordered that persons bringing to the mint 4,000 livres in specie and 1,000 livres in billets d'état should receive back coin to the amount of 5,000 livres. D'Argenson plumed himself mightily upon thus creating 5,000 new and smaller livres out of the 4,000 old and larger ones, being too ignorant of the true principles of trade and credit, to be aware of the immense injury he was inflicting upon both. The Parliament saw at once the impolicy and danger of such a system, and made repeated remonstrances to the Regent. The latter refused to entertain their petitions, when the Parliament, by a bold and very unusual stretch of authority, commanded that no money should be received in payment but that of the old standard. The Regent summoned a lit de justice and annulled the decree. The Parliament resisted and issued another. Again the Regent exercised his privilege and annulled it, till the Parliament, stung to fiercer opposition, passed another decree, dated August 12th, 1718, by which they forbade the Bank of Law to have any concern, either direct or indirect, in the administration of the revenue, and prohibited all foreigners, under heavy penalties, from interfering, either in their own names or in that of others, in the management of the finances of the state. The Parliament considered law to be the author of all the evil, and some of the councillors, in the virulence of their enmity, proposed that he should be brought to trial, and if found guilty, be hung at the gates of the Palace de Justice. Law, in great alarm, fled to the Palace Royal, and threw himself on the protection of the Regent, praying that measures might be taken to reduce the Parliament to obedience. The Regent had nothing so much at heart, both on that account and because of the disputes that had arisen relative to the legitimation of the Duke of Maine and the Count of Toulouse, the sons of the late king. The Parliament was ultimately overawed by the arrest of their president and two of the councillors, who were sent to distant prisons. Thus, the first cloud upon Law's prospects blew over. Freed from apprehension of personal danger, he devoted his attention to his famous Mississippi project, the shares of which were rapidly rising, in spite of the Parliament. At the commencement of the year 1719, an edict was published, granting to the Mississippi Company the exclusive privilege of trading to the East Indies, China, and the South Seas, and to all the possessions of the French East India Company, established by Colbert. The company, in consequence of this great increase of their business, assumed as more appropriate the title of Company of the Indies, and created 50,000 new shares. The prospects now held out by Law were most magnificent. He promised a yearly dividend of 200 livres upon each share of 500, which, as the shares were paid for in billets d'état at their nominal value, but worth only 100 livres, was at the rate of about 120% profit. The public enthusiasm, which had been so long rising, could not resist a vision so splendid. At least 300,000 applications were made for the 50,000 new shares, and Law's house in the Rue de Quincampoix was beset from morning to night by the eager applicants. As it was impossible to satisfy them all, it was several weeks before a list of the fortunate new stockholders could be made out, during which time the public impatience rose to a pitch of frenzy. Dukes, marquises, counts, with their duchesses, marchionesses, and countesses, waited in the streets for hours every day before Mr. Law's door to know the result. At last, to avoid the jostling of the plebeian crowd, which to the number of thousands filled the whole thoroughfare, they took apartments in the adjoining houses, that they might be continually near the temple whence the new Plutus was diffusing wealth. Every day the value of the old shares increased, and the fresh applications induced by the golden dreams of the whole nation became so numerous that it was deemed advisable to create no less than 300,000 new shares at 5,000 livres each, in order that the regent might take advantage of the popular enthusiasm to pay off the national debt. For this purpose, the sum of 1,500 millions of livres was necessary. Such was the eagerness of the nation that thrice the sum would have been subscribed if the government had authorized it. Law was now at the zenith of his prosperity, and the people were rapidly approaching the zenith of their infatuation. The highest and the lowest classes were alike filled with a vision of boundless wealth. There was not a person of note among the aristocracy, with the exception of the Duke of Saint-Simon and Marshal Villars, who was not engaged in buying or selling stock. People of every age and sex and condition in life speculated in the rise and fall of the Mississippi bonds. The Rue de Quincampoix was the grand resort of the jobbers, and, it being a narrow, inconvenient street, accidents continually occurred in it from the tremendous pressure of the crowd. Houses in it, worth in ordinary times 1,000 livres of yearly rent, yielded as much as 12 or 16,000. A cobbler who had a stall in it gained about 200 livres a day by letting it out, and furnishing writing materials to brokers and their clients. The story goes that a hunchbacked man who stood in the street gained considerable sums by lending his hump as a writing desk to the eager speculators. The great concourse of persons who assembled to do business brought a still greater concourse of spectators. These again drew all the thieves and immoral characters of Paris to the spot, and constant riots and disturbances took place. At nightfall, it was often found necessary to send a troop of soldiers to clear the street. Law, finding the inconvenience of his residence, removed to the Place Vendôme, whither the crowd of agitateurs followed him. That spacious square soon became as thronged as the Rue de Quincampoix. From morning to night, it presented the appearance of a fair. Booths and tents were erected for the transaction of business and the sale of refreshments, and gamblers with their roulette tables stationed themselves in the very middle of the place, and reaped a golden, or rather a paper harvest, from the throng. The boulevards and public gardens were forsaken. Parties of pleasure took their walks in preference in the Place Vendôme, which became the fashionable lounge of the idle, as well as the general rendezvous of the busy. The noise was so great all day that the Chancellor, whose court was situated in the square, complained to the regent and the municipality that he could not hear the advocates. Law, when applied to, expressed his willingness to aid in the removal of the nuisance, and for this purpose entered into a treaty with the Prince de Carignan for the Hôtel de Soissons, which had a garden of several acres in the rear. A bargain was concluded, by which Law became the purchaser of the hotel at an enormous price, the prince reserving to himself the magnificent gardens as a new source of profit. They contained some fine statues and several fountains, and were altogether laid out with much taste. As soon as Law was instilled in his new abode, an edict was published, forbidding all persons to buy or sell stock anywhere but in the gardens of the Hôtel des Soissons. In the midst, among the trees, about 500 small tents and pavilions were erected for the convenience of the stock jobbers. Their various colours, the gay ribbons and banners which floated from them, the busy crowds which passed continually in and out, the incessant hum of voices, the noise, the music, and the strange mixture of business and pleasure on the countenances of the throng, all combined to give the place an air of enchantment that quite enraptured the Parisians. The Prince de Carignan made enormous profits while the delusion lasted. Each tent was let at the rate of 500 livres a month, and as there were at least 500 of them, his monthly revenue from this source alone must have amounted to 250,000 livres, or upwards of 10,000 sterling. The honest old soldier, Marshal Villars, was so vexed to see the folly which had smitten his countrymen, that he never could speak with temper on the subject. Passing one day through the Place Vendôme in his carriage, the choleric gentleman was so annoyed at the infatuation of the people that he abruptly ordered his coachman to stop, and putting his head out of the carriage window, harangued them for full half an hour on their disgusting avarice. This was not a very wise proceeding on his part. Hisses and shouts of laughter resounded from every side, and jokes without number were aimed at him, there being at last strong symptoms that something more tangible was flying through the air in the direction of his head. The marshal was glad to drive on. He never again repeated the experiment. Two sober, quiet, and philosophic men of letters, Monsieur de Lamotte and the Abbé Terrasson, congratulated each other that they at least were free from this strange infatuation. A few days afterwards, as the worthy abbé was coming out of the Hôtel des Soissons, whither he had gone to buy shares in the Mississippi, whom should he see but his friend Lamotte, entering for the same purpose. "Ha," said the abbé, smiling. "Is that you?" "Yes," said Lamotte, pushing past him as fast as he was able. "And can that be you?" The next time the two scholars met, they talked of philosophy, of science, and of religion, but neither had courage for a long time to breathe one syllable about the Mississippi. At last, when it was mentioned, they agreed that a man ought never to swear against his doing any one thing, and that there was no sort of extravagance of which even a wise man was not capable. During this time, Law, the new Plutus, had become all at once the most important personage of the state. The antechambers of the regent were forsaken by the courtiers, peers, judges, and bishops thronged to the Hôtel des Soissons, officers of the army and navy, ladies of title and fashion, and every one to whom hereditary rank or public employ gave a claim to precedence, were to be found waiting in his antechambers to beg for a portion of his India stock. Law was so pestered that he was unable to see 1/10 part of the applicants, and in every maneuver that ingenuity could suggest, was employed to gain access to him. Peers whose dignity would have been outraged if the regent had made them wait half an hour for an interview, were content to wait 6 hours for the chance of seeing Monsieur Law. Enormous fees were paid to his servants if they would merely announce their names. Ladies of rank employed the blandishments of their smiles for the same object, but many of them came day after day for a fortnight before they could obtain an audience. When Law accepted an invitation, he was sometimes so surrounded by ladies, all asking to have their names put down in his lists as shareholders in the new stock, that in spite of his well-known and habitual gallantry, he was obliged to tear himself away par force. The most ludicrous stratagems were employed to have an opportunity of speaking to him. One lady, who had striven in vain during several days, gave up in despair all attempts to see him at his own house, but ordered her coachman to keep a strict watch whenever she was out in her carriage, and if he saw Mr. Law coming, to drive against a post and upset her. The coachman promised obedience, and for 3 days the lady was driven incessantly through the town, praying inwardly for the opportunity to be overturned. At last she espied Mr. Law, and pulling the string, called out to the coachman, "Upset us now, for God's sake, upset us now." The coachman drove against a post. The lady screamed. The coach was overturned, and Law, who had seen the accident, hastened to the spot to render assistance. The cunning dame was led into the Hotel de Soissons, where she soon thought it advisable to recover from her fright, and, after apologizing to Mr. Law, confessed her stratagem. Law smiled, and entered the lady in his books as the purchaser of a quantity of India stock. Another story is told of a Madame de Bouchard, who, knowing that Mr. Law was at dinner at a certain house, proceeded thither in her carriage, and gave the alarm of fire. The company started from table, and Law among the rest. But, seeing one lady making all haste into the house towards him, while everybody else was scampering away, he suspected the trick, and ran off in another direction. Many other anecdotes are related, which, even though they may be a little exaggerated, are nevertheless worth preserving, as shewing the spirit of that singular period. The regent was one day mentioning in the presence of D'Argenson, the Abbé de Bois, and some other persons, that he was desirous of deputing some lady, of the rank at least of a duchess, to attend upon his daughter at Modena. But, added he, I do not exactly know where to find one. No, replied one, in affected surprise. I can tell you where to find every duchess in France. You have only to go to Mr. Law's. You will see them every one in his antechamber. Monsieur de Chirac, a celebrated physician, had bought stock at an unlucky period, and was very anxious to sell out. Stock, however, continued to fall for 2 or 3 days, much to his alarm. His mind was filled with the subject, when he was suddenly called upon to attend a lady who imagined herself unwell. He arrived, was shewn upstairs, and felt the lady's pulse. It falls, good God, it falls continually, said he musingly, while the lady looked up in his face, all anxiety for his opinion. Oh, Monsieur de Chirac, said she, starting to her feet, and ringing the bell for assistance. I am dying, I am dying. It falls, it falls, it falls. What falls? Inquired the doctor in amazement. My pulse, said the lady. I must be dying. Calm your apprehensions, my dear madam, said Monsieur de Chirac. I was speaking of the stocks. The truth is, I have been a great loser, and my mind is so disturbed I hardly know what I have been saying. The price of shares sometimes rose 10 or 20% in the course of a few hours, and many persons in the humbler walks of life, who had risen poor in the morning, went to bed in affluence. An extensive holder of stock, being taken ill, sent his servant to sell 250 shares at 8,000 livres each, the price at which they were then quoted. The servant went, and on his arrival in the Jardin des Soissons, found that in the interval the price had risen to 10,000 livres. The difference of 2,000 livres on the 250 shares, amounting to 500,000 livres or 20,000 sterling, he very coolly transferred to his own use, and giving the remainder to his master, set out the same evening for another country. Law's coachman, in a very short time, made money enough to set up a carriage of his own, and requested permission to leave his service. Law, who esteemed the man, begged of him as a favour that he would endeavour before he went to find a substitute as good as himself. The coachman consented, and in the evening brought two of his former comrades, telling Mr. Law to choose between them, and he would take the other. Cookmaids and footmen were now and then as lucky, and in the full-blown pride of their easily acquired wealth, made the most ridiculous mistakes. Preserving the language and manners of their old, with the finery of their new station, they afforded continual subjects for the pity of the sensible, the contempt of the sober, and the laughter of everybody. But the folly and meanness of the higher ranks of society were still more disgusting. One instance alone, related by the Duke de Saint-Simon, will shew the unworthy avarice which infected the whole of society. A man of the name of André, without character or education, had by a series of well-timed speculations in Mississippi bonds gained enormous wealth in an incredibly short space of time. As Saint-Simon expresses it, he had amassed mountains of gold. As he became rich, he grew ashamed of the lowness of his birth, and anxious above all things to be allied to nobility. He had a daughter, an infant only 3 years of age, and he opened a negotiation with the aristocratic and needy family of Diois, that this child should, upon certain conditions, marry a member of that house. The Marquis d'Oise, to his shame, consented, and promised to marry her himself on her attaining the age of 12, if the father would pay him down the sum of 100,000 crowns and 20,000 livres every year until the celebration of the marriage. The Marquis was himself in his 33rd year. This scandalous bargain was duly signed and sealed, the stock jobber furthermore agreeing to settle upon his daughter on the marriage day a fortune of several millions. The Duke of Brancas, the head of the family, was present throughout the negotiation, and shared in all the profits. Saint Simon, who treats the matter with the levity becoming what he thought so good a joke, adds, that people did not spare their animadversions on this beautiful marriage, and further informs us that the project fell to the ground some months afterwards by the overthrow of law and the ruin of the ambitious Monsieur André. It would appear, however, that the noble family never had the honesty to return the 100,000 crowns. Amid events like these, which, humiliating though they may be, partake largely of the ludicrous, others occurred of a more serious nature. Robberies in the streets were of daily occurrence, in consequence of the immense sums in paper which people carried about with them. Assassinations were also frequent. One case in particular fixed the attention of the whole of France, not only on account of the enormity of the offence, but of the rank and high connections of the criminal. The Count de Horn, a younger brother of the Prince de Horn, and related to the noble families of d'Arenberg, de Ligne, and de Montmorency, was a young man of dissipated character, extravagant to a degree, and unprincipled as he was extravagant. In connection with two other young men as reckless as himself, named Mille, a Piedmontese captain, and one Destamps, or Lestang, a Fleming, he formed a design to rob a very rich broker, who was known, unfortunately for himself, to carry great sums about his person. The Count pretended a desire to purchase of him a number of shares in the Company of the Indies, and for that purpose appointed to meet him in a cabaret, or low public house, in the neighbourhood of the Place Vendôme. The unsuspecting broker was punctual to his appointment. So were the Count de Horn and his two associates, whom he introduced as his particular friends. After a few moments' conversation, the Count de Horn suddenly sprang upon his victim and stabbed him 3 times in the breast with a poniard. The man fell heavily to the ground, and while the Count was employed in rifling his portfolio of bonds in the Mississippi and Indian schemes to the amount of 100,000 crowns, Mille, the Piedmontese, stabbed the other assassin, who had been set to keep watch at a staircase, sprang from a window, and escaped. But Mille and the Count de Horn were seized in the very act. This crime, committed in open day, and in so public a place as a cabaret, filled Paris with consternation. The trial of the assassins commenced on the following day, and the evidence being so clear, they were both found guilty and condemned to be broken alive on the wheel. The noble relatives of the Count de Horn absolutely blocked up the antechambers of the regent, praying for mercy on the misguided youth and alleging that he was insane. The regent avoided them as long as possible, being determined that in a case so atrocious, justice should take its course. But the importunity of these influential suitors was not to be overcome so silently, and they at last forced themselves into the presence of the regent, and prayed him to save their house in the shame of a public execution. They hinted that the Princes de Horn were allied to the illustrious family of Orleans, and added that the regent himself would be disgraced if a kinsman of his should die by the hands of a common executioner. The regent, to his credit, was proof against all their solicitations, and replied to their last argument in the words of a Corneille, "Le crime fait la honte, et non pas l'échafaud," adding that whatever shame there might be in the punishment, he would very willingly share with the other relatives. Day after day they renewed their entreaties, but always with the same result. At last they thought that if they could interest the Duke de Saint-Simon in their favour, a man for whom the regent felt sincere esteem, they might succeed in their object. The Duke, a thorough aristocrat, was as shocked as they were that a noble assassin should die by the same death as a plebeian felon, and represented to the regent the impolicy of making enemies of so numerous, wealthy, and powerful a family. He urged, too, that in Germany, where the family of D'Arenberg had large possessions, it was the law that no relative of a person broken on the wheel could succeed to any public office or employ until a whole generation had passed away. For this reason, he thought the punishment of the guilty count might be transmuted into beheading, which was considered all over Europe as much less infamous. The regent was moved by this argument, and was about to consent, when Law, who felt peculiarly interested in the fate of the murdered man, confirmed him in his former resolution to let the law take its course. The relatives of D'Horn were now reduced to their last extremity. The Prince de Robec Montmorency, despairing of other methods, found means to penetrate into the dungeon of the criminal, and offering him a cup of poison, implored him to save them from disgrace. The Count de Horn turned away his head and refused to take it. Montmorency pressed him once more, and losing all patience at his continued refusal, turned on his heel, and exclaiming, "Die then as thou wilt, mean-spirited wretch. Thou art fit only to perish by the hands of the hangman," and left him to his fate. De Horn himself petitioned the regent that he might be beheaded, but Law, who exercised more influence over his mind than any other person, with the exception of the notorious Abbé Dubois, his tutor, insisted that he could not in justice succumb to the self-interested views of the De Horns. The regent had from the first been of the same opinion, and within 6 days after the commission of their crime, De Horn and Mill were broken on the wheel in the Place de Grève. The other assassin, Lestang, was never apprehended. This prompt and severe justice was highly pleasing to the populace of Paris. Even Monsieur de Quincampoix, as they called Law, came in for a share of their approbation for having induced the regent to shew no favour to a patrician. But the number of robberies and assassinations did not diminish. No sympathy was shewn for rich jobbers when they were plundered. The general laxity of public morals, conspicuous enough before, was rendered still more so by its rapid pervasion of the middle classes, who had hitherto remained comparatively pure between the open vices of the class above and the hidden crimes of the class below them. The pernicious love of gambling diffused itself through society, and bore all public and nearly all private virtue before it. For a time, while confidence lasted, an impetus was given to trade which could not fail to be beneficial. In Paris especially, the good results were felt. Strangers flocked into the capital from every part, bent not only upon making money, but on spending it. The Duchess of Orleans, mother of the regent, computes the increase of the population during this time, from the great influx of strangers from all parts of the world, at 305,000 souls. The housekeepers were obliged to make beds in garrets, kitchens, and even stables, for the accommodation of lodgers, and the town was so full of carriages and vehicles of every description that they were obliged in the principal streets to drive at a foot pace for fear of accidents. The looms of the country worked with unusual activity to supply rich laces, silks, broadcloth, and velvets, which, being paid for in abundant paper, increased in price fourfold. Provisions shared the general advance. Bread, meat, and vegetables were sold at prices greater than had ever before been known, while the wages of labor rose in exactly the same proportion. The artisan, who formerly gained 15 sous per diem, now gained 60, New houses were built in every direction. An illusory prosperity shone over the land, and so dazzled the eyes of the whole nation that none could see the dark cloud on the horizon, announcing the storm that was too rapidly approaching. Law himself, the magician whose wand had wrought so surprising a change, shared, of course, in the general prosperity. His wife and daughter were courted by the highest nobility, and their alliance sought by the heirs of ducal and princely houses. He bought 2 splendid estates in different parts of France, and entered into a negotiation with the family of the Duke de Sully for the purchase of the Marquisate of Rosny. His religion being an obstacle to his advancement, the regent promised, if he would publicly conform to the Catholic faith, to make him Comptroller General of the Finances. Law, who had no more real religion than any other professed gambler, readily agreed, and was confirmed by the Abbé de Tencin in the Cathedral of Melun, in presence of a great crowd of spectators. On the following day he was elected honorary churchwarden of the parish of St. Roch, upon which occasion he made it a present of the sum of 500,000 livres. His charities, always magnificent, were not always so ostentatious. He gave away great sums privately, and no tale of real distress ever reached his ears in vain. At this time he was by far the most influential person of the state. The Duke of Orleans had so much confidence in his sagacity and the success of his plans that he always consulted him upon every matter of moment. He was by no means unduly elevated by his prosperity, but remained the same simple, affable, sensible man that he had shewn himself in adversity. His gallantry, which was always delightful to the fair objects of it, was of a nature so kind, so gentlemanly, and so respectful, that not even a lover could have taken offence at it. If upon any occasion he shewed any symptoms of haughtiness, it was to the cringing nobles, who lavished their adulation upon him till it became fulsome. He often took pleasure in seeing how long he could make them dance attendance upon him for a single favour. To such of his own countrymen as by chance visited Paris, and sought an interview with him, he was, on the contrary, all politeness and attention. When Archibald Campbell, Earl of Islay, and afterwards Duke of Argyll, called upon him in the Place Vendôme, he had to pass through an antechamber crowded with persons of the first distinction, all anxious to see the great financier, and have their names put down as first on the list of some new subscription. Law himself was quietly sitting in his library, writing a letter to the gardener at his paternal estate of Lauriston about the planting of some cabbages. The Earl stayed for a considerable time, played a game of piquet with his countrymen, and left him charmed with his ease, good sense, and good breeding. Among the nobles who, by means of the public credulity at this time, gained sums sufficient to repair their ruined fortunes, may be mentioned the names of the Dukes de Bourbon, de Guiche, de la Force, de Chaulnes, and d'Antin, the Maréchal d'Estrier, the Princess de Rohan, de Poix, and de Léon. The Duke de Bourbon, son of Louis XIV, by Madame de Montespan, was peculiarly fortunate in his speculations in Mississippi paper. He rebuilt the royal residence of Chantilly in a style of unwonted magnificence, and being passionately fond of horses, he erected a range of stables, which were long renowned throughout Europe, and imported 150 of the finest racers from England to improve the breed in France. He bought a large extent of country in Picardy, and became possessed of nearly all the valuable lands lying between the Oise and the Somme. When fortunes such as these were gained, it is no wonder that Law should have been almost worshipped by the mercurial population. Never was monarch more flattered than he was. All the small poets and litterateurs of the day poured floods of adulation upon him. According to them, he was the saviour of the country, the tutelary divinity of France. Wit was in all his words, goodness in all his looks, and wisdom in all his actions. So great a crowd followed his carriage whenever he went abroad, that the regent sent him a troop of horse as his permanent escort to clear the streets before him. It was remarked at this time that Paris had never before been so full of objects of elegance and luxury. Statues, pictures, and tapestries were imported in great quantities from foreign countries and found a ready market. All those pretty trifles in the way of furniture and ornament which the French excel in manufacturing were no longer the exclusive playthings of the aristocracy, but were to be found in abundance in the houses of traders and the middle classes in general. Jewellery, of the most costly description, was brought to Paris as the most favourable mart. Among the rest, the famous diamond bought by the regent and called by his name, and which long adorned the crown of France. It was purchased for the sum of 2 millions of livres, under circumstances which shew that the regent was not so great a gainer as some of his subjects by the impetus which trade had received. When the diamond was first offered to him, he refused to buy it, although he desired above all things to possess it, alleging as his reason that his duty to the country he governed would not allow him to spend so large a sum of the public money for a mere jewel. This valid and honourable excuse threw all the ladies of the court into alarm, and nothing was heard for some days but expressions of regret that so rare a gem should be allowed to go out of France, no private individual being rich enough to buy it. The regent was continually importuned about it, but all in vain until the Duke de Saint-Simon, who with all his ability was something of a twaddler, undertook the weighty business. His entreaties being seconded by Law, the good-natured regent gave his consent, leaving to Law's ingenuity to find the means to pay for it. The owner took security for the payment of the sum of 2 millions of livres within a stated period, receiving in the meantime the interest of 5% upon that amount, and being allowed, besides, all the valuable clippings of the gem. Saint-Simon, in his Memoirs, relates with no little complacency his share in this transaction, after describing the diamond to be as large as a greengage, of a form nearly round, perfectly white, and without flaw, and weighing more than 500 grains. He concludes with a chuckle, by telling the world that he takes great credit to himself for having induced the regent to make so illustrious a purchase. In other words, he was proud that he had induced him to sacrifice his duty and buy a bauble for himself at an extravagant price out of the public money. Thus the system continued to flourish till the commencement of the year 1720. The warnings of the Parliament, the too great a creation of paper money would sooner or later bring the country to bankruptcy, were disregarded. The regent, who knew nothing whatever of the philosophy of finance, thought that a system which had produced such good effects could never be carried to excess. If 500 millions of paper had been of such advantage, 500 millions additional would be of still greater advantage. This was the grand error of the regent, and which Law did not attempt to dispel. The extraordinary avidity of the people kept up the delusion, and the higher the price of Indian and Mississippi stock, the more billets de banque were issued to keep pace with it. The edifice thus reared might not unaptly be compared to the gorgeous palace erected by Potemkin, that princely barbarian of Russia, to surprise and please his imperial mistress. Huge blocks of ice were piled upon one another. Ionic pillars of chastest workmanship in ice formed a noble portico, and a dome of the same material shone in the sun, which had just strength enough to gild, but not to melt it. It glittered afar like a palace of crystals and diamonds. But there came one warm breeze from the south, and the stately building dissolved away, till none were able even to gather up the fragments. So with Law and his paper system. No sooner did the breath of popular mistrust blow steadily upon it, than it fell to ruins, and none could raise it up again. The first slight alarm was early in 1720. The Prince de Conti, offended that Law should have denied him fresh shares in India stock at his own price, sent to his bank to demand payment in specie of so enormous a quantity of notes that 3 wagons were required for its transport. Law complained to the Regent, and urged on his attention the mischief that would be done if such an example found many imitators. The Regent was but too well aware of it, and, sending for the Prince de Conti, ordered him under penalty of his high displeasure to refund the bank 2/3 of the specie which he had withdrawn from it. The prince was forced to obey the despotic mandate. Happily for Law's credit, de Conti was an unpopular man. Everybody condemned his meanness and cupidity, and agreed that Law had been hardly treated. It is strange, however, that so narrow an escape should not have made both Law and the Regent more anxious to restrict their issues. Others were soon found who imitated, from motives of distrust, the example which had been set by de Conti in revenge. The more acute stock jobbers imagined justly that prices could not continue to rise forever. Bourdon and La Richardière, renowned for their extensive operations in the funds, quietly, and in small quantities at a time, converted their notes into specie, and sent it away to foreign countries. They also bought as much as they could conveniently carry of plate and expensive jewellery, and sent it secretly away to England or to Holland. Vermalet, a jobber, who sniffed the coming storm, procured gold and silver coin to the amount of nearly 1,000,000 of livres, which he packed in a farmer's cart and covered over with hay and cow dung. He then disguised himself in the dirty smock frock or blouse of a peasant, and drove his precious load into safety into Belgium. From thence he soon found means to transport it to Amsterdam. Hitherto, no difficulty had been experienced by any class in procuring specie for their wants, but this system could not long be carried on without causing a scarcity. The voice of complaint was heard on every side, and inquiries being instituted, the cause was soon discovered. The council debated long on the remedies to be taken, and Law, being called on for his advice, was of opinion that an edict should be published depreciating the value of coin 5% below that of paper. The edict was published accordingly, but failing of its intended effect, was followed by another, in which the depreciation was increased to 10%. The payments of the bank were at the same time restricted to 100 livres in gold, and 10 in silver. All these measures were nugatory to restore confidence in the paper, though the restriction of cash payments within limits so extremely narrow kept up the credit of the bank. Notwithstanding every effort to the contrary, the precious metals continued to be conveyed to England and Holland. The little coin that was left in the country was carefully treasured, or hidden until the scarcity became so great that the operations of trade could no longer be carried on. In this emergency, Law hazarded the bold experiment of forbidding the use of specie altogether. In February 1720, an edict was published, which, instead of restoring the credit of the paper as was intended, destroyed it irrecoverably, and drove the country to the very brink of revolution. By this famous edict, it was forbidden to any person whatever to have more than 500 livres of coin in his possession, under pain of a heavy fine and confiscation of the sums found. It was also forbidden to buy up jewelry, plate, and precious stones, and informers were encouraged to make search for offenders by the promise of one half the amount they might discover. The whole country sent up a cry of distress at this unheard-of tyranny. The most odious persecution daily took place. The privacy of families was violated by the intrusion of informers and their agents. The most virtuous and honest were denounced for the crime of having been seen with a louis d'or in their possession. Servants betrayed their masters, one citizen became a spy upon his neighbor, and arrests and confiscations so multiplied that the courts found a difficulty in getting through the immense increase of business thus occasioned. It was sufficient for an informer to say that he suspected any person of concealing money in his house, and immediately a search warrant was granted. Lord Stair, the English ambassador, said that it was now impossible to doubt of the sincerity of Law's conversion to the Catholic religion. He had established the Inquisition, after having given abundant evidence of his faith in transubstantiation by turning so much gold into paper. Every epithet that popular hatred could suggest was showered upon the regent and the unhappy Law. Coin to any amount above 500 livres was an illegal tender, and nobody would take paper if he could help it. No one knew today what his notes would be worth tomorrow. Never, says Duclos, in his secret memoirs of the Regency, was seen a more capricious government. Never was a more frantic tyranny exercised by hands less firm. It is inconceivable to those who were witnesses of the horrors of those times, and who look back upon them now as a dream, that a sudden revolution did not break out, that Law and the Regent did not perish by a tragical death. They were both held in horror, but the people confined themselves to complaints, a sombre and timid despair, a stupid consternation had seized upon all, and men's minds were too vile even to be capable of a courageous crime. It would appear that, at one time, a movement of the people was organized. Seditious writings were posted up against the walls, and were sent in handbills to the houses of the most conspicuous people. One of them, given in the Memoirs de la Régence, was to the following effect: Sir and Madam, this is to give you notice that a St. Bartholomew's Day will be enacted again on Saturday and Sunday, if affairs do not alter. You are desired not to stir out, nor you, nor your servants. God preserve you from the flames. Give notice to your neighbours. Dated Saturday, May the 25th, 1720. The immense number of spies with which the city was infested rendered the people mistrustful of one another, and beyond some trifling disturbances, made in the evening by an insignificant group which was soon dispersed, the peace of the capital was not compromised. The value of shares in the Louisiana or Mississippi stock had fallen very rapidly, and few indeed were found to believe the tales that had once been told of the immense wealth of that region. A last effort was therefore tried to restore the public confidence in the Mississippi project. For this purpose, a general conscription of all the poor wretches in Paris was made by order of government. Upwards of 6,000 of the very refuse of the population, were impressed as if in time of war, and were provided with clothes and tools to be embarked for New Orleans, to work in the gold mines alleged to be abound there. They were paraded, day after day, through the streets with their pikes and shovels, and then sent off in small detachments to the outports to be shipped for America. 2/3 of them never reached their destination, but dispersed themselves over the country, sold their tools for what they could get, and returned to their old course of life. In less than 3 weeks afterwards, 1/2 of them were to be found again in Paris. The maneuver, however, caused a trifling advance in Mississippi stock. Many persons of superabundant gullibility believed that operations had begun in earnest in the new Golconda, and that gold and silver ingots would again be found in France. In a constitutional monarchy, some surer means would have been found for the restoration of public credit. In England, at a subsequent period, when a similar delusion had brought on similar distress, how different were the measures taken to repair the evil! But in France, unfortunately, the remedy was left to the authors of the mischief. The arbitrary will of the regent, which endeavoured to extricate the country, only plunged it deeper into the mire. All payments were ordered to be made in paper, and between the 1st of February and the end of May, notes were fabricated to the amount of upwards of 1,500 millions of livres, or 60 million sterling. But the alarm once sounded, no art could make the people feel the slightest confidence in paper which was not exchangeable into metal. Monsieur Lambert, the president of the Parliament of Paris, told the regent to his face that he would rather have 100,000 livres in gold or silver than 5 millions in the notes of his bank. When such was the general feeling, the superabundant issues of paper but increased the evil by rendering still more enormous the disparity between the amount of specie and notes in circulation. Coin, which it was the object of the regent to depreciate, rose in value on every fresh attempt to diminish it. In February, it was judged advisable that the Royal Bank should be incorporated with the Company of the Indies. An edict to that effect was published and registered by the Parliament. The state remained the guarantee for the notes of the bank, and no more were to be issued without an order in council. All the profits of the bank, since the time it had been taken out of Law's hands and made a national institution, were given over by the regent to the Company of the Indies. This measure had the effect of raising for a short time the value of the Louisiana and other shares of the company, but it failed in placing public credit on any permanent basis. A council of state was held in the beginning of May, at which Law, D'Argenson, his colleague in the administration of the finances, and all the ministers were present. It was then computed that the total amount of notes in circulation was 2,600 millions of livres, while the coin in the country was not quite equal to half that amount. It was evident to the majority of the council that some plan must be adopted to equalize the currency. Some proposed that the note should be reduced to the value of the specie, while others proposed that the nominal value of the specie should be raised till it was on an equality with the paper. Law is said to have opposed both these projects, but failing in suggesting any other, it was agreed that the note should be depreciated 1/2. On the 21st of May, an edict was accordingly issued, by which it was decreed that the shares of the Company of the Indies and the notes of the bank should gradually diminish in value, till at the end of a year they should only pass current for 1/2 of their nominal worth. The Parliament refused to register the edict, The greatest outcry was excited, and the state of the country became so alarming that as the only means of preserving tranquillity, the Council of the Regency was obliged to stultify its own proceedings by publishing within 7 days another edict, restoring the notes to their original value. On the same day, the 27th of May, the bank stopped payment in specie. Law and Dargenson were both dismissed from the ministry. The weak, vacillating, and cowardly regent threw the blame of all the mischief upon Law, who, upon presenting himself at the Palais Royal, was refused admittance. At nightfall, however, he was sent for and admitted into the palace by a secret door, when the regent endeavoured to console him, and made all manner of excuses for the severity with which, in public, he had been compelled to treat him. So capricious was his conduct, that 2 days afterwards he took him publicly to the opera, where he sat in the royal box alongside of the regent, who treated him with marked consideration in face of all the people. But such was the hatred against Law that the experiment had well nigh proved fatal to him. The mob assailed his carriage with stones just as he was entering his own door, and if the coachman had not made a sudden jerk into the courtyard, and the domestics closed the gate immediately, he would in all probability have been dragged out and torn to pieces. On the following day, his wife and daughter were also assailed by the mob as they were returning in their carriage from the races. When the regent was informed of these occurrences, he sent Law a strong detachment of Swiss guards, who were stationed night and day in the court of his residence. The public indignation at last increased so much that Law, finding his own house, even with this guard, insecure, took refuge in the Palace Royal, in the apartments of the regent. The Chancellor, D'Aguesseau, who had been dismissed in 1718 for his opposition to the projects of Law, was now recalled to aid in the restoration of credit. The regent acknowledged too late that he had treated with unjustifiable harshness and mistrust one of the ablest and perhaps the sole honest public man of that corrupt period. He had retired ever since his disgrace to his country house at Fresnes, where, in the midst of severe but delightful philosophic studies, he had forgotten the intrigues of an unworthy court. Law himself and the Chevalier de Conflans, a gentleman of the regent's household, were dispatched in a post-chaise with orders to bring the ex-chancellor to Paris along with them. D'Aguesseau consented to render what assistance he could, contrary to the advice of his friends, who did not approve that he should accept any recall to the office of which Law was the bearer. On his arrival in Paris, 5 councillors of the Parliament were admitted to confer with the Commissary of Finance, and on the 1st of June an order was published abolishing the law which made it criminal to amass coin to the amount of more than 500 livres. Everyone was permitted to have as much specie as he pleased. In order that the banknotes might be withdrawn, 25 millions of new notes were created, on the security of the revenues of the city of Paris at 2.5%. The banknotes withdrawn were publicly burned in front of the Hôtel de Ville. The new notes were principally of the value of 10 livres each, and on the 10th of June the bank was reopened with a sufficiency of silver coin to give in change for them. These measures were productive of considerable advantage. All the population of Paris hastened to the bank to get coin for their small notes, and silver becoming scarce, they were paid in copper. Very few complained that this was too heavy, although poor fellows might be continually seen toiling and sweating along the streets, laden with more than they could comfortably carry, in the shape of change for 50 livres. The crowds around the banks were so great that hardly a day passed that someone was not pressed to death. On the 9th of July, The multitude was so dense and clamorous that the guards stationed at the entrance of the Mazarin Gardens closed the gate and refused to admit any more. The crowd became incensed and flung stones through the railings upon the soldiers. The latter, incensed in their turn, threatened to fire upon the people. At that instant, one of them was hit by a stone, and taking up his piece, he fired into the crowd. One man fell dead immediately, and another was severely wounded. It was every instant expected that a general attack would have been commenced upon the bank. But the gates of the Mazarin Gardens being opened to the crowd, who saw a whole troop of soldiers with their bayonets fixed ready to receive them, they contented themselves by giving vent to their indignations in groans and hisses. 8 days afterwards, the concourse of people was so tremendous that 15 persons were squeezed to death at the doors of the bank. The people were so indignant that they took 3 of the bodies on stretchers before them and proceeded to the number of 7 or 8 thousands to the gardens of the Palace Royal, that they might shew the regent the misfortunes that he and Law had brought upon the country. Law's coachman, who was sitting at the box of his master's carriage in the courtyard of the palace, happened to have more zeal than discretion, and not liking that the mob should abuse his master, he said, loud enough to be overheard by several persons, that they were all blackguards, and deserved to be hanged. The mob immediately set upon him, and thinking that Law was in the carriage, broke it to pieces. The imprudent coachman narrowly escaped with his life. No further mischief was done. A body of troops making their appearance, the crowd quietly dispersed, after an assurance had been given by the regent that the 3 bodies they had brought to shew him should be decently buried at his own expense. The Parliament was sitting at the time of this uproar, and the President took upon himself to go out and see what was the matter. On his return, he informed the councillors that Law's carriage had been broken by the mob. All the members rose simultaneously and expressed their joy by a loud shout, while one man, more zealous in his hatred than the rest, exclaimed, "And Law himself, is he torn to pieces?" Much undoubtedly depended on the credit of the Company of the Indies, which was answerable for so great a sum to the nation. It was therefore suggested in the Council of the Ministry that any privileges which could be granted to enable it to fulfill its engagements would be productive of the best results. With this end in view, it was proposed that the exclusive privilege of all maritime commerce should be secured to it, and an edict to that effect was published. But it was unfortunately forgotten that by such a measure all the merchants of the country would be ruined. The idea of such an immense privilege was generally scouted by the nation, and petition on petition was presented to the Parliament that they would refuse to register the decree. They refused accordingly, and the regent, remarking that they did nothing but fan the flame of sedition, exiled them to Blois. At the intercession of D'Aguesseau, the place of banishment was changed to Pontoise, and thither accordingly the councillors repaired, determined to set the regent at defiance. They made every arrangement for rendering their temporary exile as agreeable as possible. The President gave the most elegant suppers, to which he invited all the gayest and wittiest company of Paris. Every night there was a concert and ball for the ladies. The usually grave and solemn judges and councillors joined in cards and other diversions, leading for several weeks a life of the most extravagant pleasure, for no other purpose than to shew the regent of how little consequence they deemed their banishment, and that when they willed it, they would make Pontoise a pleasanter residence than Paris. Of all the nations in the world, the French are the most renowned for singing over their grievances. Of that country it has been remarked with some truth that its whole history may be traced in its songs. when Law, by the utter failure of his best laid plans, rendered himself obnoxious, satire of course seized hold upon him, and while caricatures of his person appeared in all the shops, the streets resounded with songs, in which neither he nor the regent was spared. Many of these songs were far from decent, and one of them in particular counselled the application of all his notes to the most ignoble use to which paper can be applied. Among the caricatures that were abundantly published, and that shewed as plainly as graver matters that the nation had awakened to a sense of its folly, was one, a facsimile of which is preserved in the Memoirs Delusions. It was thus described by its author: the goddess of shares, in her triumphal car, driven by the goddess of folly. Those who are drawing the car are impersonations of the Mississippi, with his wooden leg, the South Sea, the Bank of England, the Company of the West of Senegal, and of various assurances. Lest the car should not roll fast enough, the agents of these companies, known by their long foxtails and their cunning looks, turn round the spokes of the wheels, upon which are marked the names of the several stocks and their value, sometimes high and sometimes low, according to the turns of the wheel. Upon the ground are the merchandise, daybooks, and ledgers of legitimate commerce, crushed under the chariot of folly. Behind is an immense crowd of persons of all ages, sexes, and conditions, clamouring after fortune, and fighting with each other to get a portion of the shares which she distributes so bountifully among them. In the clouds sits a demon, blowing bubbles of soap, which are also the objects of the admiration and cupidity of the crowd, who jump upon one another's backs to reach them ere they burst. Right in the pathway of the car, and blocking up the passage, stands a large building, with 3 doors, through one of which it must pass, if it proceeds farther, and all the crowd along with it. Over the first door are the words, Hôpital des Faux, over the second, Hôpital des Malades, and over the third, Hôpital des Gueux. Another caricature represented Law sitting in a large cauldron, boiling over the flames of popular madness, surrounded by an impetuous multitude, who are pouring all the gold and silver into it, and receiving gladly in exchange the bits of paper, which he distributed among them by handfuls. While this excitement lasted, Law took good care not to expose himself unguarded in the streets. Shut up in the apartments of the regent, he was secure from all attack, and whenever he ventured abroad it was either incognito or in one of the royal carriages, with a powerful escort. An amusing anecdote is recorded of the detestation in which he was held by the people, and the ill treatment he would have met had he fallen into their hands. A gentleman of the name of Bourcel was passing in his carriage down the Rue Saint Antoine, when his farther progress was stayed by a hackney coach that had blocked up the road. Monsieur Boursel's servant called impatiently to the hackney coachman to get out of the way, and on his refusal struck him a blow on the face. A crowd was soon drawn together by the disturbance, and Monsieur Bourzel got out of the carriage to restore order. The hackney coachman, imagining that he now had another assailant, bethought him of an expedient to rid himself of both, and called out as loudly as he was able, "Help, help! Murder, murder! Here are Law and his servant going to kill me! Help, help!" At this cry the people came out of their shops, armed with sticks and other weapons, while the mob gathered stones to inflict summary vengeance upon the supposed financier. Happily for Monsieur Bourcel and his servant, the door of the church of the Jesuits stood wide open, and seeing the fearful odds against them, they rushed towards it with all speed. They reached the altar, pursued by the people, and would have been ill-treated even there, if, finding the door open leading to the sacristy, they had not sprang through and closed it after them. The mob were then persuaded to leave the church by the alarmed and indignant priests, and finding Monsieur Bourzel's carriage in the street, they vented their ill will against it, and did it considerable damage. The 25 millions secured on the municipal revenues of the city of Paris, bearing so low an interest as 2.5%, were not very popular among the large holders of Mississippi stock. The conversion of the securities was therefore a work of considerable difficulty, for many preferred to retain the falling paper of Law's company in the hope that a favorable turn might take place. On the 15th of August, with a view to hasten the conversion, an edict was passed declaring that all notes for sums between 1,000 and 10,000 livres should not pass current, except for the purchase of annuities and bank accounts, or for the payment of installments still due on the shares of the company. In October following, another edict was passed, depriving these notes of all value whatever, after the month of November next ensuing. The management of the mint, the farming of the revenue, and all the other advantages and privileges of the India or Mississippi Company were taken from them, and they were reduced to a mere private company. This was the death blow to the whole system, which had now got into the hands of its enemies. Law had lost all influence in the Council of Finance, and the company, being despoiled of its immunities, could no longer hold out the shadow of prospect of being able to fulfill its engagements. All those suspected of illegal profits at the time the public delusion was at its height were sought out and immersed in heavy fines. It was previously ordered that a list of the original proprietors should be made out, and that such persons as still retained their shares should place them in deposit with the company, and that those who had neglected to complete the shares for which they had put down their names should now purchase them of the company at the rate of 13,500 livres for each share of 500 livres. Rather than submit to pay this enormous sum for stock which was actually at a discount, the shareholders packed up all their portable effects and endeavored to find a refuge in foreign countries. Orders were immediately issued to the authorities at the ports and frontiers to apprehend all travelers who sought to leave the kingdom, and keep them in custody until it was ascertained whether they had any plate or jewelry with them, or were concerned in the late stock jobbing. Against such few as escaped, the punishment of death was recorded, while the most arbitrary proceedings were instituted against those who remained. Law himself, in a moment of despair, determined to leave a country where his life was no longer secure. He at first only demanded permission to retire from France to one of his country seats, a permission which the regent cheerfully granted. The latter was much affected at the unhappy turn affairs had taken, but his faith continued unmoved in the truth and efficacy of Law's financial system. His eyes were opened to his own errors, and during the few remaining years of his life, he constantly longed for an opportunity of again establishing the system upon a securer basis. At Law's last interview with the prince, he is reported to have said, "I confess that I have committed many faults. I committed them because I am a man, and all men are liable to error. But I declare you most solemnly that none of them proceeded from wicked or dishonest motives, and that nothing of the kind will be found in the whole course of my conduct." 2 or 3 days after his departure, the regent sent him a very kind letter, permitting him to leave the kingdom whenever he pleased, and stating that he had ordered his passports to be made ready. He at the same time offered him any sum of money he might require. Law respectfully declined the money, and set out for Brussels in a post-chaise belonging to Madame de Prie, the mistress of the Duke of Bourbon, escorted by 6 horse guards. From thence he proceeded to Venice, where he remained for some months, the object of the greatest curiosity to the people, who believed him to be the possessor of enormous wealth. No opinion, however, could be more erroneous. With more generosity than could have been expected from a man who during the greatest part of his life had been a professed gambler, he had refused to enrich himself at the expense of a ruined nation. During the height of the popular frenzy for Mississippi stock, he had never doubted of the final success of his projects in making France the richest and most powerful nation of Europe. He invested all his gains in the purchase of landed property in France, a sure proof of his own belief in the stability of his schemes. He had hoarded no plate or jewelry and sent no money, like the dishonest jobbers, to foreign countries. His all, with the exception of one diamond worth about 5 or 6 thousand pounds sterling, was invested in the French soil, and when he left that country, he left it almost a beggar. This fact alone ought to rescue his memory from the charge of knavery, so often and so unjustly brought against him. As soon as his departure was known, all his estates and his valuable library were confiscated. Among the rest, an annuity of 200,000 livres on the lives of his wife and children, which had been purchased for 5 millions of livres, was forfeited, notwithstanding that a special edict, drawn up for the purpose in the days of his prosperity, had expressly declared that it should never be confiscated for any cause whatever. Great discontent existed among the people that Law had been suffered to escape. The mob and the Parliament would have been pleased to see him hanged. The few who had not suffered by the commercial revolution rejoiced that the quack had left the country. But all those, and they were by far the most numerous class, whose fortunes were implicated, regretted that his intimate knowledge of the distress of the country, and of the causes that had led to it, had not been rendered more available in discovering a remedy. At a meeting of the Council of Finance and the General Council of the Regency, documents were laid upon the table, from which it appeared that the amount of notes in circulation was 2,700 millions. The Regent was called upon to explain how it happened that there was a discrepancy between the dates at which these issues were made and those of the edicts by which they were authorized. He might have safely taken the whole blame upon himself, but he preferred that an absent man should bear a share of it, and he therefore stated that Law, upon his own authority, had issued 1,200 millions of notes at different times, and that he, the Regent, seeing that the thing had been irrevocably done, had screened Law by antedating the decrees of the Council which authorized the augmentation. It would have been more to his credit if he had told the whole truth while he was about it, and acknowledged that it was mainly through his extravagance and impatience that Law had been induced to overstep the bounds of safe speculation. It was also ascertained that the national debt, on the 1st of January, 1721, amounted to upwards of 3,100 millions of livres, or more than 124,000 sterling, the interest upon which was 3,196,000. A commission, or visa, was forthwith appointed to examine into all the securities of the state creditors, who were to be divided into 5 classes, the first 4 comprising those who had purchased their securities with real effects, and the latter comprising those who could give no proofs that the transactions they had entered into were real and bona fide. The securities of the latter were ordered to be destroyed, while those of the first 4 classes were subjected to a most rigid and jealous scrutiny. The results of the labours of the visa was a report in which they counselled the reduction of the interest upon these securities to 56 millions of livres. They justified this advice by a statement of the various acts of peculation and extortion which they had discovered, and an edict to that effect was accordingly published and duly registered by the Parliament of the kingdom. Another tribunal was afterwards established, under the title of the Chambre de l'Arsenal, which took cognizance of all the malversations committed in the financial departments of the government during the late unhappy period. A master of requests named Falhonet, together with the Abbé Clement and 2 clerks in their employ, had been concerned in divers acts of peculation to the amount of upwards of 1,000,000 of livres. The first 2 were sentenced to be beheaded, and the latter to be hanged, but their punishment was afterwards commuted into imprisonment for life in the Bastille. Numerous other acts of dishonesty were discovered and punished by fine and imprisonment. D'Argenson shared with Law and the Regent the unpopularity which had alighted upon all those concerned in the Mississippi madness. He was dismissed from his post of Chancellor to make room for D'Aguesseau, but he retained the title of Keeper of the Seals, and was allowed to attend the councils whenever he pleased. He thought it better, however, to withdraw from Paris, and live for a time a life of seclusion at his country seat. But he was not formed for retirement, and becoming moody and discontented, he aggravated a disease under which he had long laboured, and died in less than a 12-month. The populace of Paris so detested him that they carried their hatred even to his grave. As his funeral procession passed to the church of St. Nicholas du Chardonneret, the burying place of his family, it was beset by a riotous mob, and his 2 sons, who were following as chief mourners, were obliged to drive as fast as they were able down a by-street to escape personal violence. As regards Law, he for some time entertained a hope that he should be recalled to France to aid in establishing its credit upon a firmer basis. The death of the regent in 1723, who expired suddenly as he was sitting by the fireside conversing with his mistress, the Duchess de Valois, deprived him of that hope, and he was reduced to leave his former life of gambling. He was more than once obliged to pawn his diamond, the sole remnant of his vast wealth, but successful play generally enabled him to redeem it. Being persecuted by his creditors at Rome, he proceeded to Copenhagen, where he received permission from the English ministry to reside in his native country, his pardon for the murder of Mr. Wilson having been sent over to him in 1719. He was brought over in the Admiral's ship, a circumstance which gave occasion for a short debate in the House of Lords. Earl Coningsby complained that a man who had renounced both his country and his religion should have been treated with such honour, and expressed his belief that his presence in England at a time when the people were so bewildered by the nefarious practices of the South Sea directors would be attended with no little danger. He gave notice of a motion on the subject, but it was allowed to drop, no other member of the House having the slightest participation in his lordship's fears. Law remained for about 4 years in England, and then proceeded to Venice, where he died in 1729 in very embarrassed circumstances. The following epitaph was written at the time: Sicil s'est accusé célèbre, c'est calculateur sans égal, qui, par les relais sur l'algèbre, a mis les France à l'hôpital. His brother, William Law, who had been concerned with him in the administration both of the bank and the Louisiana Company, was imprisoned in the Bastille for alleged malversation, but no guilt was ever proved against him. He was liberated after 15 months, and became the founder of a family, which is still known in France under the title of Marquises of Lareston.